I didn't invite you on the show to spend an hour agreeing with you, so I think now's a good time to move on to the actual criticisms that Dawkins has made specifically in regards to.
Right off the bat, and I know this is kind of like a William Lane Craig trademark, but it's going to be very difficult. Uh, and I'll preamble this with not talking about somebody's immutable characteristics, but this face and that smile is going to be difficult to stare at because it's almost like he's locked into that and it's bizarre.
It looks like he's taking a shit half the time. Yeah.
At all times. It's just he's in a constant state of struggle.
Why he refuses to debate you. As I've said before, a lot of people want to see this debate, and I know that you've offered him the opportunity a number of times, and he's turned it down. And he claims that the reason that he does this, whether this be the real reason or not, the reason he gives is that William Lane Craig is an immoral person because he is an apologist for genocide, pointing specifically in his original article and original objection to the issue of the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, which you've defended as a morally defensible thing for God to have commanded and for the Israelites to have enacted. So what I really want to do now is jump into this story. I want to talk about the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, what happened, why it's problematic, and what your moral defense is of that story. So perhaps we can begin by talking about who were the Canaanites.
Um, yeah. So, who were the Canaanites? I wonder if he will get into it as far as any actual evidence that this genocide even took place at all, and that the atrocities that they were supposedly committing, if there's any evidence that any of that actually took place, or if this was just more, kind of current day wartime propaganda.
He does not get into that.
No,
He-
I'd love it if somebody would.
he's not a historian. He's a philosopher.
Yeah,
So.
just literally anything outside of the Bible that said that the Canaanites specifically. I know that there's some evidence for some the surrounding cultures that were not part of the Hebrew offspring of Canaan and Abraham and some of those cultures. There is some evidence that they were doing some human sacrificing, this and that. But for the Canaanites specifically, there's literally nothing. So it'd be
I,
nice to hear. But
yeah, I say the same about the Midianites. I get that comment on my last video, and they're like, "Oh, you're just those people are killing the kids." I'm like, "There's not a verse I'm aware of. I don't know of any external historical evidence saying that specifically Midianites were doing this." But they get these groups here and there, and then they just lump in everybody into this umbrella, except for Israel,
Mhm.
of course, as if they grew up in a bubble, in a society
Right.
unaffected by any of this, and they just like,
Right. And most likely the Israelites, without getting too much on a tangent here, because we're what, 30 seconds in. Most likely the Canaanites and the Israelites they were the same tribe. The Canaanites existed and the Israelites just integrated into the Canaanite society, from what I understand. And then they just kind of made up this whole story about how they actually conquered the Canaanites, but there's a lot of archaeological evidence to suggest this, but whether or not they were actually taking place in any type of barbaric practice, but
yeah,
Prior to Israel's liberation from bondage in Egypt, the land
yeah.
of Canaan, or modern day Israel,
pause,
was
pause.
populated.
You can feel free to do this at 125 or so, or 150, because he talks so slow. I think
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good idea.
we would save some time and still not lose the message here.
All right, we'll start at 125 and see if it's still too slow.
By small clans of Canaanite inhabitants.
Yeah, and this is exactly what I was just saying. It's more likely that another Hebrew clan just integrated into Canaanite society, and there was never this whole battle never actually took place. So like you said, he's not a historian, but maybe he should look into it a little bit before he goes on a massive defense. It's not just a genocide defense. You're defending something that almost certainly did not even take place. You could just get around it, and a lot of apologists do. They just say, well, actually, like in your video, it's this is more hyperbolic or kind of wartime propaganda.
Hmm.
I mean, he could just say like, well, that probably actually didn't happen, and then boom, it's done. But
Yeah, I think he probably knows all that stuff. He just doesn't agree, because he'll get into it later about his stance on inerrancy, and that's why it all comes down to this.
hold on, give me one sec. I'm gonna let the video play for a minute. I gotta switch up my headset real quick.
Okay.
According to the biblical narrative, these clans of Canaanites were extremely evil. They were debauched morally and opposed God. And God let this go on for 400 years while Israel was in Egypt. But then
All right, I apologize. My headset died right in the middle of that for some reason. What were you saying?
I was just gonna say that was the fastest reload I've ever seen. like do boom back of the ear. Let's go, folks.
The show must go on. Yeah, I have a well. So it didn't die. All right, I don't want to get into that tangent.
It's okay.
I'll just say that the audio thing that I said you were too quiet. 100% just my earbud, because now that I switched out, you're loud and clear, so that's good.
Awesome.
Yeah. Right. I think you were saying something when I.
Oh, he's just really explaining the stuff. You can probably play it till he stops talking, and then we'll fucking jump in on
Okay.
what he says.
All right.
He called Israel out of Egypt and led them to the land of Canaan and delivered the land over to Israel and said, drive out the Canaanites from the land on pain of death. And I am giving this land to you, to Israel. So they were the pre-Israeli inhabitants of this region of the world, eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea.
And as you say, the Old Testament makes it clear that God considered these people to be an immoral people, much in the same way that before the flood of Noah, we sort of had this pleading with God of saying, look, are there not any good people amongst this community? Are you really going to flood the entire world? Is there not one person worth saving? And as far as I know, most people...
I'd have to say here, Alex is getting his stories mixed up, because I caught this in the first go around. He's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, not Noah's flood. There's no bargaining in the Noah flood story.
Yeah. Yeah, a little bit.
defend God's action here by saying that the answer is no, that the society had become so corrupt that there wasn't any sort of salvageable morality. And suppose something like that is going on with the Canaanites here. I suppose...
If I might comment, this is not simply biblically attested. I have a colleague, Professor Clay Jones, who has done a study of ancient literature coming out of pre-Israelite Canaan. And it is horrific culture that is described there. This was one that practiced not only all sorts of human sexual aberrations, but also temple.
So basically just homosexuality. That's what he means by that.
I would say worshiping different gods is the biggest offense that Yahweh's pissed off about. It's like
Yeah.
freedom of religion is what he's hating the most.
Yeah, and that's another thing, is I don't know why. It's a little bit frustrating, because if he just looks at this from a secular point of view, it's almost certain. Again, this is thousands of years ago, so you can't say for certain what was going on back then. But if you do look at the literature, as he just said, the Canaanites and the Israelites almost certainly were worshiping the same God. It was just a different name. So yeah. I think it was, oh boy, they had Yahweh, and I think the Canaanites had, oh boy, I'm digging deep here, digging deep into the memory banks. Was it El?
Shaddai, El Elyon, El.
I think, you know what? I can't go off of that, but yeah, I mean, like, this is something that when I was covering videos of the genocide defense and stuff, I do a deep dive because I don't want to go on the internet forever looking stupid. So I try to back up what I say with some facts and stuff. And yeah, that's, if a secular point of view, A, almost certainly didn't happen, and B, they're probably worshiping the same God. And it's like this, William Lane Craig, the philosopher, can't just take like 2 seconds of doing some research to realize the secular point of view. And it makes sense, because then he would have to say that the Bible was wrong.
I would say he mentioned Clay Jones. Are you aware of Clay Jones? Have you?
Clay Jones? I don't think so.
He is a very abrasive gentleman who's an apologist, and he's kind of in the same camp of Copan. You know who Copan is? Paul
Yeah,
Copan?
I know Paul Copan.
Yeah, and he mentions his research that he does about this stuff, which I've never heard of, never looked into Clay Jones's specific stuff, which is, I would be interested in seeing what he has to bring, because that's one of my gripes. Like, it sounds like it's probably one of your gripes too, is where is this specific evidence for specifically this group or specifically that group doing all these ne'er-do-well type of things, you know?
Yeah, and there isn't any. I'm going on record and I'm saying it. There just isn't any. Like, it just doesn't exist. Not in literature, not in archaeology. No, for the Canaanites, like I said, for the Canaanites specifically, it just does not exist.
Yep.
But apologists get paid.
Prostitution in the worship of God. They practice bestiality. There are
Prostitution. Oh no.
texts describing how a buck would be strapped down to a wooden frame, and then women would mount the buck and copulate with it. They were engaged in offering child sacrifice to their gods.
It simply isn't true. It's nothing that he's saying right now is true. Just zero evidence, except for literal propaganda. There's just no evidence for it. How bizarre.
It is. It's like you just make up the gnarliest, grossest sounding stories you can and just pin it on another group and then say, well, they had it coming.
Yeah, literal propaganda. Like, oh my God, they would strap down a buck. And let's just say that this was true. And okay, so that's pretty gross. But I don't think worthy of eradicating an entire race of people for, especially if you're a god. If you're a god, you could just go down to these people and explain to them, hey, this is not okay. And as a god, you would know exactly what to say to make them acknowledge that this was not okay. But instead, you just eradicate the entire group of people.
Oh, we're going to get into that. And I was saying it for when we get to that part, because that's my biggest gripe with this whole thing. is
Yeah.
God can handle his own business. He's a big boy.
Yeah. And this is the number one reason, because I've done quite a few videos on the slaughter of various tribes, and my comment section, which people people get up in arms about, just like William Lane Craig is here. And the number one reason that I get for why this would have been commanded is that because of the child sacrificing. I don't think I've actually heard the whole like bestiality thing, maybe peppered in here and there, but it's not a big one. It's the child sacrifice, to which you don't kill all of the children included if you want to stop the child sacrifice. And I've said it before, a perfect way to stop child sacrifice is to kill all of the children. That will prevent any further child sacrifices, but that's not the best way to go about it.
Definitely not the most moral. But
Yeah.
keep in mind this whole evil is the cause of this, because it's going to flip really quick on that too.
Okay.
And so reading these ancient documents that are from pre-Israelite Canaan really bear out the truth of the biblical description of them, though the
Hold on. I'm sorry. Everything he's saying is just, unless I misheard.
gods. And so reading these ancient documents that are from pre-Israelite Canaan,
Show me one pre-Israelite Canaanite document. Is he saying that there's documents that still exist from 4,000 years ago?
This would be worth looking up, because, like I said, Clay Jones, he pointed us in the direction of
Mm-mm.
a source, but also any of the ancient scholars in the atheist camp, like possibly Kip Davis or Josh Bowen, or any of these guys might have an inkling what the hell he's talking about. So
Yeah, I would be incredibly surprised if there was any like original document from 4,000 years. I guess what were the Canaanites? Be 3,500 years ago ish. I'd be very surprised. I'm confident enough to say that that document that he's referring to doesn't exist. Almost certainly, but maybe it does. Maybe I'm wrong.
really bear out the truth of the biblical description of them, though the biblical description doesn't go into that kind of morbid detail that these documents do.
I suppose I intuitively find it difficult to believe that there's not a single person in this community who is not like unsalvageably touched or consumed by sin in this way, that the actions we see the Israelites committing on the command of God can be justified. So to give people an idea, to give them the full picture, we've described who the Canaanites are, and I'm sure you'll have something to say about that, but the reason that this is a problem, the reason why Richard Dawkins is talking about these people, is because, as you say, God promises this land to the Israelites, and he waits 400 years. Says this is because the sin sort of hasn't got bad enough yet, essentially. He says it will happen in 400 years, because by that point things will be so bad that this will be sort of justifiably inflicted. But he commands the Israelites to destroy the Canaanites. And the language used in the Bible is quite extreme in a few different areas, talking about completely destroying a city, leaving nothing alive that breathes. On the point about innocent people, because I know you'll have something to say about that, but we know that there are at least some innocent people among the Canaanites, because in the 6th chapter of Joshua, in the destruction of Jericho,
Yes.
it said that they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Now, maybe the men and women were immoral. I certainly don't think that children living among the Canaanites were immoral enough to justify their being killed, and certainly not the
Right.
cattle, the sheep, and the donkeys.
Right. The difficult, I think, aspect of this is the children. The adults were corrupt. If there was an innocent person among the adults, that person didn't have to be killed. It's important to understand that God's command to Israel was not genocide, despite a superficial first reading of these narratives. More fundamentally, it was a command to
Pause.
drive the Canaanites out.
I like how he slips in superficial. He always does that. He insults the intelligence of whoever he's going against. Like, apology, I had a brain dead faith, and whoever's reading this and it says slaughter all everybody in the town has a superficial reading of the text, and it's like, come on, could you stop that already, Bill? Like, we get it. Like,
Yeah. I like to take the approach that if there is a God, and this God did divinely inspire, or however you want to put it, write the Bible, everything I need to know would be in that Bible. And if it's not in that Bible, then it's not trustworthy, or God did not want me to know it. So I would say that it's not a superficial reading. It's how it's exact. It reads exactly how a God would want me to read it. And if you have to be like a philosophy major or a historian to maybe get a grasp on how it could be different than exactly how the Bible describes it, um, I mean, it's an utter failing, I guess I would say, on that God's part.
well, and I would think that this is exactly what Jesus was railing against with the Pharisees when it came to the New Testament. Like, you guys, he's talking to an elite class who were like the gatekeepers of the scroll or the Torah or whatever. But it's changed since then, because now everybody has access to it. Back then, it was kind of like same as the Roman Catholic
Mhm.
days, where only the elect few would be parsing it out to everybody, and they'd be charged with memorizing it if they could, but he would still get on their case for this, like, and he's now Bill Craig and other intellectuals in the field, not to bash intellectualism, but like they do
Mm.
this in the apologetic sphere where, like if you're not reading it my way, you're reading it a dumb way or whatever,
Yeah,
and that frustrates me.
a superficial way. Yeah, it's not a it's not a superficial reading. It's reading it verbatim.
Exactly. Yes,
Yeah,
reading it literally and reading it
yeah,
is the problem, and it's like, how
right.
dare you read it literally?
Yeah. I mean, you could if you. I don't know. Let's keep going.
Out of the land on pain of death. No one had to be killed if these tribes would simply retreat and flee in the face of the advancing Israeli army. It was only those who tried to stay behind and resist who were to be completely exterminated. So people didn't have to die. They
Uh, uh, Jesus. First off, retreat where, and scripturally show me where it says that if they were to retreat, that they didn't have to die.
He gets into it right after this because they start talking about the AI, and this is where I was proud of Alex. I think he did a really good job on this interview. He
Mm.
remained even keeled. He didn't get emotionally and just kind of like lose his shit. He was trying to be fair to Craig while also maintaining his own stance on it. And you'll see this right in the next section. He talks about AI. So
Oh boy. Okay.
weren't pursued and chased down until everyone was exterminated. These clans were driven out of the land. They would be destroyed as nation states, but not as individual people. And it's important to understand
And I just want to input real quick that this qualifies for the definition of a genocide. You don't have to kill every single person of that nation state, ethnicity, race, whatever. Simply eradicating the nation state, even if you don't eradicate all of the people, is a genocide. Even if you don't kill a single person and all you do is remove them from their land and disperse them, that's also a genocide. So this is meeting the definition of genocide at every turn, even if they didn't kill all of the people.
that for these ancient Near Eastern people, as for modern Near Eastern people, it is the land that is so important. It is all about the land. Even today, when you go to Israel, people will talk about
pause.
coming to.
Now that is the reverse 180 on his position about the justice. He's saying it's not about the justice; it's all about the land grab. And so it's like, make up your mind, bro.
Well, one is I think meant to appeal to your emotion, and one is accurate. One is saying, hey, yeah, they did kill these people, but you got to understand they were doing some really horrible things. And that's an appeal to the emotional side of people, like, oh man, well at least they did stop the child sacrifices and all that. And then the other one is 100% accuracy, that they just wanted that land, Lebensraum, as we'll call it.
YouTube Punk asks a good question here. I'm guessing you haven't seen this yet, YouTube Punk, because that is the exact question that Alex asks him towards the end of this interview. And if you stick around for the whole show, you can see it.
Hmm.
The land. That's how they refer to it. So what God was doing was giving the land of Canaan from or to Israel and divesting these Canaanite clans of the possession of the land of
Yeah, so if you just take out the God part, he's describing history now. They just wanted that land. Yeah, absolutely.
Canaan. And so they were driven out, and not all of them were killed. Later in the narratives in the Pentateuch, you find
And again, you don't have to completely eradicate every single person in a tribe, ethnicity, clan, whatever, to constitute a genocide. So, and that's a really common apologetic against a genocide of these different tribes, is that, well, how could they have been genocided if later on in the Bible they're still around? It's like, well, they didn't complete their genocide, but it was a genocide nonetheless.
Yeah, and it's not my problem with it at all. My problem is whenever they would think God would command one person to kill another person. It doesn't matter if it's a big group, little group. If it's one person to kill another person, then he's going against what they tell us is his own objective moral standard. And then it gets really confusing. And it's like, well, fucking what, dude? Like, make up your mind.
Yeah. Well, do you think it would be going against his own moral standard if he commanded another person to kill another person?
If one of his commandments is do not kill,
Yeah.
right?
So, okay, all right. I think I see what you're saying. I think I misheard you. Okay,
And to answer Bread of Life's question, I will not be alive in 3,000 years. So
well, what was the question, real quick?
would I defend ISIS if everyone's talking about everyone brutally slaughtering ISIS?
The response to that, I think, would be that it depends. Did a god command all of the children of ISIS to be slaughtered along with ISIS? All, the parents. well, let's give it to them. Let's say that they're doing some terrible stuff. The parents are. If God commanded the children of those, and I'm not talking about like 14, 15. I'm talking, young enough that you could safely get those people out of their indoctrination, the children out of their indoctrinated state. If God commanded those children to be killed as well, yeah, I think people would be talking about it a little bit. Sure.
Canaanites still about.
Yeah.
So they weren't all killed.
If I may, on this point that we've got to so far, firstly, this idea that, well, not everybody's killed because they're given the opportunity to leave their land. They're the opportunity to be driven out. It's only if they stay and resist that they get killed. And the way you just hash that out is by saying, so they had a decision and didn't have to die. It seems to me that, of course, you're going to understand this is something that God has commanded. So whatever the reason may be, it must be the morally right thing to do. However, from my perspective, what I'm seeing here is a foreign nation approaching the native inhabitants of land which they believe is their own, saying, you need to leave. And when they refuse, killing them, and then saying, well, look, I gave you a choice, didn't I? Because you could have just left. I mean, that in other words, doesn't seem like much of a defense to me.
Right. We were talking about whether or not the Canaanites were corrupt and whether or not this was an act of divine judgment upon them. But I've not explicated here the moral theory that undergirds my defense of this action. It is very possible that had this been undertaken by human initiative alone, that it would have been immoral, as the way you described. But the ethical theory that I defend is called divine command morality. And this has two components to it. First is that the good is based in God himself. God is the paradigm of moral goodness. He is by nature loving, fair, just, and so forth. Second element is that God's nature then expresses itself toward us in the form of divine commands that constitute our moral duties. According to this theory, moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by a qualified authority. So, for example, if I were driving and some random person told me to pull over, I wouldn't have any obligation to obey that person at all. But if a policeman commanded me to pull over, then in virtue of his authority, I would have a legal obligation to.
Yeah. He had me kind of what he was saying in the beginning is divine command theory, I think, or what did he say? Divine command, whatever. He used a different
The
word.
theory of divine
Morality.
command, something morality.
I think it's a divine command morality. I think that's abhorrent, of course, but it's a perfectly acceptable answer to this entire question is that if God commanded it, then it must have been good in some way, even if we can't wrap our minds around it. Again, it's a disgusting answer, but he switched from legal or a moral legal obligation real quick there. And maybe I paused it too soon, but
No, this is about where it starts going south in the interview, and it starts getting worse and worse from here. So it's
yeah, I don't.
you can play more about it because it's gonna keep saying stuff that we're gonna have to keep pausing on because
Okay.
we can address it all now. All the stuff that's popping up in your mind right now
Well, yeah, it's
will
just,
be popping up, and then we can address it as it comes. I'm sure.
it's almost easy to see where he's taking it, but he keeps kind of flip flopping back and forth because I don't think you would have a moral obligation to pull over for an authority figure. A legal obligation, sure, but I don't think it'd be immoral not to. So I'm
That's
curious
true.
where he's going with that.
Yeah,
Pull over
'cause
and obey what.
I was just to say like because the cop, if you started grilling him on that point, he'd feel like, well, the cop's just a human, and then it'd be a special pleading case because
And yeah, and that's exactly the point is, yeah, that we're talking about why is he comparing? So it's okay. You know what? No. I'm not going off on another tangent here. Let's go.
What he's done. And so the theory is that moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by the paradigm of goodness himself, who is God. Now, presumably, God doesn't issue commands to himself as to what he should do. And therefore, on this theory, God has no moral obligations to fulfill. And therefore, as you rightly said, it's possible that God could do something wrong because right and wrong are defined by divine commands, and God doesn't issue commands to himself to obey. So, what constraint is there then on the moral commands of God? Well, it will be his own perfectly good nature, his own just and loving nature that will determine whether or not a command is available to him. Now, what this means is that there are lots of actions then that God can perform that would be prohibited morally to us. For example, you wouldn't have the moral right to kill me. But
So might makes right is essentially what I gathered from all of that.
I'm not gonna go so. I know that's a trope people say, might makes right. Oh, it's bad, but for my stance on morality, I think it's a two-part thing. I think it's legislation and enforcement, and so there is a might makes right thing to it. It's not exclusively it though. But my
Yeah.
objection with what Bill here is saying is that he's gonna be, or he's already stepped into the Euthyphro dilemma. Does God have a good standard outside for him? He's acting towards, or his commands, and obviously as a divine command theorist, he's taking the command route. But
Mhm.
that always gets the can kicked down on the road to his nature, which he already did that too. And so the contradiction lies that if it was his nature to to abhor murder, to abhor genocide, to abhor whatever the horrible evils we're talking about, it would be impossible for him to command it by his own nature.
Sure. But I think that's pretty easy to kind of skirt around because, well, whereas God would command somebody to be killed, it wouldn't be murder in that case. And I think the Ten Commandments would be murder, not just necessarily killing somebody. But I don't think God. Let me preface this real quick. It's all stupid. I'm not giving this. These are not good apologetics. I want to make that very clear. But I think you can skirt around it pretty easy with just simply saying that to us it seems like murder, it seems like genocide, but since God commanded it, it cannot be that. It has to be some type of moral justification for these commands simply because of God's nature. Whereas a secular person could never see the morality of it. I think if you're a divine command theorist, simply saying that it seems evil to us, but it simply cannot be, I think that kind of pretty much skirts around the entire Euthyphro dilemma.
Well, yeah, but it's
Um,
just leading with your presuppositions, essentially.
sure.
I guess like that's all he's doing. And then, what's the saying? Good people will do bad, but for a good person to do bad, it takes religion. And I
Mm.
would just add presupposition on the end of that. It takes a religious presuppositions to do that.
Oh yeah, yeah. In no other circumstance would William Lane Craig be up here defending any type of. Oh shit! I just had a light bulb go out. Any type of. Yeah,
Earpieces or light bulbs, like,
yeah.
damn.
Everything's going out.
I think God wants us to stop the stream here.
Oh damn it! All right. Well, we can schedule it for another day. I think that was a pretty good sign. Man, I just bought that bulb too. What were we saying? Yeah, mean, I think the Euthyphro dilemma isn't very convincing to me because whereas it's gross, don't get me wrong. A person would have to say is, yeah, God commanded it. It's good. It was a moral command. The cleansing of the Canaanites and the Midianites and the Amalekites and the other ites. Yeah, it was good. And then I think the Euthyphro dilemma is pretty much squashed at that point. It forces a person to defend genocide, but to them, it's not a genocide. It's a moral cleansing, if you will.
He does say the word cleansing.
Oh, Jesus. Oh my God.
Oh.
Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and my hopes of hearing anything new were pretty much just squashed, but well, maybe he'll surprise me. Again, this is just, there's just nothing new here, nothing insightful. It's pretty standard apologetics for genocide. It's gross, but let's keep going.
But if God wants to strike me dead right now, that's his prerogative. God takes and gives life as he will. So if God wills to end the life of the Canaanite children prematurely, that's his prerogative. So God doesn't have the same sort of moral constraints that we do because he doesn't have moral obligations to fulfill. He has to act only in consistency with his own nature. And so when you think of it in those terms, Alex, the problem posed by the conquest narrative is as follows.
Yeah, he's
Alex
like a hawk. William Lane Craig is like a piece of just a piece of meat right now. Look at that hawk death stare he has.
I almost thought that he was trying to hold in some vomit. Like,
yeah. Like, how could you let that fall out of your mouth? It's awful.
But also, what he says, he's almost saying God is amoral. And I know that term doesn't really exist in Christianity. It's either good or evil. There's no in between.
Mhm.
But what he's saying, it sounds like God is amoral. And that really butts up against the God is love trope. And so, like, if God has no moral commands, but his nature is love, that means sometimes it is loving to wipe out a group of people. And loving according to who? According to him, because everything is done for his glory. So it becomes very like, I'm shuddering,
Yeah. Yeah. If I hadn't heard it like 1,400 times by now, I mean, just go to any of the videos of genocide coverage here. And the comment sections are just full of stuff like this, packed full of stuff. Some are worse than this, for sure. But it's just, yeah, I mean, it's nothing new, all gross. Realistically, I mean, and that's why your last video, and I'll probably bring it up a few more times throughout this, hit so hard because of what's currently taking place with none other than the Israelites. Is William Lane Craig, would he use these defenses of what's happening right now? Would he use the same defense?
We will get into that too, but it won't be
Jesus.
the Israelites as the example. It'll be everybody's favorite example, the big bad mustache man.
Oh, well, okay. I'm curious what you have to say about it, but I want to know. I'm curious what William Lane Craig's opinion on what's happening right now in Israel is, but maybe we'll never know.
It's very similar to the problem of evil. that there is a sort of internal inconsistency between two propositions affirmed by the Judeo-Christian faith. The first would be that God is all just and all loving. And the second, in this case, would be that God has issued a command to Israel to drive out the Canaanites on pain of death from the land. And so my argument is that those two propositions are completely consistent with each other because God wrongs no one in issuing such a command. And if he wrongs no one, then there is no...
Bringing it back to what Alex said in the beginning here with Noah's flood. I know he flubbed up a little bit there, but if God commanded something, what William Lane Craig is saying is that if God commanded something, it has to be a good command. But God also commanded the flood, which he regretted. So that theory is already completely bunked just with Noah's flood.
Checkmate.
Yeah. You can't say that it was inherently good because even God said that, hey, probably shouldn't have done that. Yeah.
That's a great point.
More.
Yeah.
I just think he's not thinking of a lot of the counters to his position. And I think Alex is a really good philosopher, but I don't think he's super strong in the Bible. Like, I don't think he knows his references that well. Or if he was on a time limit, he couldn't sit there and drag it out for 3 hours debating.
Yeah, and it makes sense because it seems like this is more of an interview, but actually an interview instead of a lot of people set up an interview and it's just kind of like a facade of an actual debate. This seems like an actual just, hey, what's your opinion on this, and giving some counters to it. But it seems more of like an interview more so than a debate. So I can see why Alex wouldn't push him super hard on it.
Yeah, it is. Side note, though, you said earlier that you're not as familiar with Alex's more recent work or whatever, but you know who Peter Hitchens is? Hitch's brother. Like, he actually interviewed him not too long ago, and Peter Hitchens lost his shit. It was so funny, and he even stormed out of the interview. And I would say that Alex was being as mild mannered as he is now, maybe a little spicier, but not much. And Peter, it was hilarious. Like, memes for days because Peter Hitchens just walked out. And the thumbnail was like Alex looking at Peter's ass while he walked off the screen. It was so funny.
Jesus, what an odd combination of brothers that was, huh?
Yeah,
Hitchens brothers. Wow.
Yeah, that has nothing to do with anything. I just made me think of it.
That's funny.
Constraint on his issuing such a command.
Now, I see a few problems with this, and I think my listeners will too intuitively. There's nothing I can say to prove that that's wrong, that maybe God can just permit things like the killing of innocent children by an Israelite clan. Maybe that is just okay. But the problems this raises include things like this is raised by Randall Rouser. He points out that this seems to undermine our ability to trust moral intuition. In other contexts, such as in the moral argument for the existence of God, and appeal to the fact that we all know that certain things are morally right and morally wrong, and we sort of use that feeling to say that there must be some objective element of morality in the universe, and we use that.
So I understand the human need to give social cues, but man, William Lane Craig just takes it to the extreme. If somebody's saying something and you want to demonstrate visibly that you're listening to them, you might give a couple of little head nods. But at 1.25 speeds, he's just...
It's like he's in the NBA selling a foul. Whoa, flopping all over the place.
Yeah, he's a strange individual. With that kind of consistent struggling to take a crap smile, and I'm sorry. I was just looking at him, and he's just
taking that shit.
Yeah,
taking shit.
Yeah.
That's the construction argument for the existence of God. It seems, as Russell points out, that nothing could be more intuitively wrong to me in this regard than the killing of an innocent child. And what we're told to believe is that, okay, maybe most of the time that's wrong. Maybe that's always wrong unless it's specifically commanded by God. But sometimes it is actually just okay, as long as God commands it, meaning that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with killing innocent children. It can't be intrinsically wrong if there are circumstances in which it's actually not just permitted, but in fact the thing that you're ordered to do.
I would say that it is wrong.
No, screw you, Bill. If you believe in divine command theory, nothing is intrinsically wrong because all right and wrong comes from an external source. That's it.
Yeah.
In the absence of a divine command, but that God has the ability to override that by issuing a divine command, which then becomes our moral duty. And as long as this ethical theory is possible and coherent, then there just is no inconsistency between his being all good.
Well, there's a big difference between possible and coherent, which possible, I mean, I guess, I suppose you can't demonstrate that it's impossible, but coherent, no, as we just demonstrated. If God hadn't retracted, if God didn't have regrets in the Bible, which he did, and many of them, then this would make sense. But when you have a God who regrets his commands, it's no longer a divine command. It's no longer divine command theory. It's a command that's coming from the divine, but it does not follow in the divine command theory.
So what he's trying to do here, he's trying to salvage the moral argument because if he goes full divine command theory, the moral argument goes out the window. But he does so in a weird way. So he's saying all of us have objective morality, intuitively in our hearts or whatever. Maybe I'm not totally correct on the verbiage, but something like that.
It's close enough.
But God has the ability to hit override on that. And the question would be, if I already have objective morality in my heart, if I'm seeing somebody being murdered and objectively I'm saying, no, that feels wrong. But then God jumps in and says, no, you go and also help kill that person with the person that's murdering them. Then he's essentially override good with his good or good.
His gooder, yeah.
And it makes the morality even more subjective, because now the top of the food chain is God's subjective morality. And I know we'll all argue that it is subjective because he's a person in the first place, but it's like Bill is saying the words, but he doesn't comprehend what he's saying. And so he's saying God's subjective morality overrides objective morality, but still we have to take the moral argument seriously for objective morality. And that's proof for the God who has subjective morality to override the objective morality.
Okay. So I think objective or gooder morality. Objectivist goodest morality. The best goodest morality.
And he's doing this just in light of what he said, what he got memed about by Apologia in 22, when he's saying, well, if the story's so good, it's worth believing. It's like, well, now we're talking about a different part of the story. Do you still think the story sounds so good? Like, you think it's all one story pointing to Jesus? Like, and now he has to get away from the feel good part of the New Testament, and it's like, here's the bad, ugly part of it, and you're still saying it's good, and you have to tell me it feels so good that you hope it's true. It's weird.
It's weird. It's very weird.
And all loving, and is issuing and of this sort. In the absence of a divine command, as I say, it could well have been immoral. But given the presence of divine command, it becomes the moral obligation of those persons to whom it was issued. Now, so it doesn't undermine our moral intuitions about what's right and wrong. It just introduces the qualification of a divine.
Going off of what you said just a minute ago, he's saying the words, but he's not comprehending what he's saying. He's saying the words. He's definitely saying the words. But if you took every single thing that William Lane Craig has said so far and cut it down to God said it, so it's good, this review would play out the exact same way. He didn't have to say all of this. He could have just, every response to Alex could have been, well, God said it, so it's good. And the interview would have been the exact same thing. He's saying that in a very long-winded way.
Yep. I want to address this for JR really quick. JR, the moral argument is presented by everybody's favorite apologist, C.S. Lewis. In a nutshell, says, how would you know a crooked line unless you saw a straight line? Let's sub out the lines, the crooked line and the straight line, for killing or not killing a person. I see somebody being killed, so now I know that not killing somebody is good. But if God overrides me seeing that person being killed and says, hey, no, that's actually a straight line, now I have two straight lines. How do I tell the difference? That's it.
Yeah. And just to address that last comment, it would have been the same if he didn't explain his argument. He's not explaining his argument. He's saying God said it, so it's good, in an incredibly long way. He's not diving into the who, where, and whys. He's just saying it in a very wordy way. But that's all he is saying, is, well, God said it, so it's good. He said just a second ago that if it isn't a moral command, but then a divine command overrides it, then it now becomes a moral command. That's just a long way of saying God said it, so it's good. That's it.
Yeah, and it's to even override your internal intuitions about what is good and evil.
Yeah, everything. God said it, so it's God commanded it, so it's good, I guess is a more accurate way. If it came from God, it's good no matter what the command is. That's all William Lane Craig is saying.
Command.
It would mean that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with taking the life of an innocent child. Nothing intrinsically wrong with
well,
only if God says it, then it becomes good. I'm prophesying right now that William Lane Craig's response to that is going to be like, he's going to say, well, no, unless God says it, then it's good.
Okay, I think he's struggling to keep the moral argument intact here, though, too. So he's conflicted.
Yeah, we'll see. JR, if I'm right on this, then I hope you will then understand that he's not explaining his argument. He's just repeating the same thing over and over again. Maybe I'm wrong. Let's go.
Again, this is going to depend on your moral theory, Alex. I think that right and wrong, moral obligations, are determined by imperatives issued by qualified authority. And so in the absence of such imperatives, there literally is no right and wrong. It's a subjective illusion of human consciousness. And I think this is one of the real problems of atheism, is that lacking a moral lawgiver and moral authority, it has no basis for affirming objective right and wrong. These are just either patterns of behavior that have emerged from the socio-biological pressures of the evolutionary process, or else they're
okay.
Evolution.
Yeah.
It's funny because he actually believes in evolution. Now he's starting to sound like a yucker.
Yeah, Okay, so as of this moment, I was wrong. He didn't say God said it, so it's good. He just completely circumvented answering the question by saying, "Well, what's your standard for morality?"
Whereas
The
it's a
old,
personal.
the old, I know you are, but what am I? Dictator.
Yeah, no, but you too. You can't. How, listen, Alex. How can you even say that killing a child is evil when you don't have an objective standard to say that it's evil? No.
Preference and taste. In neither case, then, are they normative. So, in the absence of a moral authority to issue these imperatives, there wouldn't be any objective right or wrong. But given such a divine moral lawgiver, there is objective right and wrong. But that moral lawgiver,
I hate to pause it again so soon, but did you see Alex bite his tongue there? Alex understands what's happening. He understands that the question is being dodged currently. He was gonna cut in, but he decided to let him finish. He did the old like
He is a smart
ahead and
enough.
let.
He's a smart enough chap that he keeps people in line. So, like,
Yeah.
it's funny because the part that we skipped in the 18 minutes prior was Craig was congratulating Alex for making Dawkins look foolish without Dawkins knowing he was looking foolish, or something along those lines. Maybe I'm saying harsher, but by the end of this, it's doing the same thing to Craig. He lets
Mm.
Craig have enough rope to hang himself, and he just does
Yeah.
it.
himself doesn't have the same moral obligations that we do.
I suppose if I'm being asked to accept wholesale a biblical morality, I suppose I would look at something like this and, as Lincoln said, slavery, think, if this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I mean, maybe I can't make a moral claim. Maybe I can't say that there is such thing as morality and immorality in the universe, but something inside of me tells me that if there is such thing as ethics, it can't look like this. In other words, you're asking me, in order to accept the justification for the actions in the story, to deny one of the most forceful moral intuitions, the exact kind of moral intuition which you might ask me to rely upon in other contexts to
Yes.
establish God's existence at all.
Yes, and as I say, I affirm that moral intuition. If these actions had been undertaken in the absence of a divine command, it would be objectively wrong. But the point would be is that on a divine
Oh,
command,
all right. So then he immediately goes into saying,
It would have been
"Well,
wrong.
God said it."
I know it's super wrong, but God said it wasn't, so it's not.
Yeah. If God said it, it must be good. Or if it's a command from God, then it must be moral.
and theory of ethics, God is free to issue a command that goes against that, so long as it is consistent with his just and loving nature. And so the burden here.
Okay. So the question that I would ask at this point is, how is the killing of a child consistent with his good and loving nature? To which I suppose the response would be, because he cannot issue a command that goes against his good and loving nature, so it must be consistent with his good and loving nature, I would assume. Sorry, that was a thought that I had just out loud.
Would be to show that in issuing this command, God does something that contradicts his perfectly just and loving nature. And my argument is that that's very difficult to show because he doesn't wrong anyone, I think, in
Yeah.
this. In particular, the difficult case here is the children. And what I would say is, first, that God has the right to take anyone's life whenever.
So real
Oh,
quick,
yeah.
if JR, if you're still watching this, tell me how he's not just saying, if God said it, it must be right over and over again. What is he explaining? That's
And also, I'd like to put a disclaimer out there because it's getting hairy at this point. If anybody is sensitive faculties, they might want to just take a step out, or yeah. What was I going to say? I was going to say something else. I don't know. I'll think about it. Play.
Whenever he wants to. Unfortunately, children die all the time in infancy. And so if God wants to end the life of these Canaanite children early, prematurely, that's his prerogative. But then secondly, on my theology, these children go immediately to heaven. They go to be with God.
how and why? I just did the video on this that almost every Christian would disagree with him. I mean, I suppose that's too much to get into. We won't do it.
Yeah, the child heaven hell thing is not extremely clear in the Bible at all. This is why it's been fought over by different denominations.
Sure, yeah. But as far as I can tell, the whole heaven and hell thing didn't necessarily even exist pre-Jesus. But it goes against, and that's why I said I wasn't going to go into it, because there's just that small statement covers so much. Because what you're essentially saying is that Jesus isn't okay. Hold on. Let's roll back a little bit. If William Lane Craig thinks that the Canaanite children would have gone to heaven, what he is also saying is that Jesus is completely unnecessary, because you actually can get into heaven without being saved. So why did we, if God can allow children or whoever he does want into heaven, why the whole sins and salvation thing? Why did that even have to happen?
And that's another layer on top of this, because this is, we have to remember that this is all pre-Jesus dying on the cross. And so
That's exactly the point, is if people could get into heaven pre-Jesus, why on earth did we need the whole Jesus thing?
yeah, because this would actually make all the children's sacrifices that the other countries were doing good, right? Because then all those
In a
babies
way,
go
yeah.
straight to heaven.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the most selfless things you could do, I guess, is to ensure your child's entry into heaven. But if they didn't need Jesus, why does anybody else need Jesus?
God, and therefore come to know a life that is more glorious and more happy than anything
No.
conceivable, and certainly far better than if they had been allowed to live and be raised in such a corrupt and evil environment as they were in. So it was actually a tremendous blessing to these children for them to be killed and go to heaven and be
Oh
with
my,
God.
okay.
You must understand how that sounds. It was a blessing for these children to be killed and go to God. I mean, this is something that Dawkins quotes you on directly, and I'm
Mhm.
interested in you share my assessment here that even if he's not correct, I can understand why he would hear you say something like that and think that it's morally repugnant, that it's revolting. In any
Yeah.
other context, if somebody says something like, well, maybe the
For someone,
Oh, God damn it. Not in any other context, but in this context as well. Shit, where the hell were we? Well, let me get back.
of a moral authority to issue these imperatives, there wouldn't be any objective right or wrong. But given such a divine moral is free to issue a command that goes against that, so long as it is consistent with its just and loving nature. And so that it was actually a
Oh,
tremendous.
did we already listen to
Which
that? Or is
one?
that a new part?
I think so. I'm
It's
sorry.
hard because
I ruined it.
he rambles all together, and it's just like he's saying the same thing.
Yeah,
Over and over.
yeah, literally, you could pick any point in this in this whole stream, and you wouldn't know which part of William Lane Craig you were actually listening to.
But that's when he said it isn't. He can issue any commands as long as they are not in contradiction to his just and loving nature. And so, if the actions themselves are intrinsically moral, then him saying anything is in line with his just and loving nature because he is the standard of just and loving. And so he could say kick a puppy or pet a puppy, and they would be the
Mhm.
same thing because he's saying it. So it's and either would be loving because it's coming from God. And
Mhm.
this is great in philosophy, but this does not translate well to the real world at all. Especially when everybody's trying to preach to me about their different gods and they don't agree with each other and they don't know what the fuck they're talking about when they're talking about the Bible half the time or the Quran or whatever other holy book they're trying to spout God is from, then it makes for a big mess. And I think it's an unnecessary component to morality that it jumbles the works interpersonally between people on a pragmatic level. Sorry, that was a
Yeah.
rant.
Yeah, no.
But I want to. Okay, I'll ask you because since while you're looking, we should probably got this out of the way in the beginning. What would you understanding of what is morality?
Morality. Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but so objective morality, I think, is a silly concept. At least in a sense that you can prove it. Like, how do you prove that something is or is not moral? I don't think you can necessarily demonstrate that. However, I think uh yeah, I guess you could sum it up. I have a couple of issues, a couple of problems with the well-being, or what is it? Well, would go with that. Just the well-being argument. You can arrive at objective conclusions about morality, is of what is or is not better for human well-being, uh, without going into taking up the whole stream because because you can with a morality argument.
Yeah, I
What is
think
conducive to human well-being? What's is good for all of us, and what isn't? And you can get to conclusions, I guess you could say, of what is or is not good for humans. And that's it's open for public for public debate. And realistically, everybody agrees with that, whether they realize it or not, because everybody you live in a society, you participate in elections, and you try to get your version of morality signed into law. Um, yeah, I'll stop there.
well, let me just. This is my nutshell pitch of what I believe morality to be. It's a social agreement between two or more individuals on how to best behave. And so some people be like, well, you can be immoral to yourself, and I don't think how you treat yourself has to do anything to do with morality. I think that's a matter of integrity, which is close but not uh, exactly similar to morality. But whenever I think of morality, I think, well, it's how me and another person would interact with each other, and we come to a negotiation, an agreement about how this is how I want to be treated, this is how I want to be treated, and then it spreads out among society. The more individuals you get, and obviously, since we're all individuals, and I'm a subjective moralist, I think we all have different ideas about what's best for
Mhm.
societies, and so that's where it really comes into play. The negotiating and the finer arts of diplomacy and all that stuff comes into play. But if you throw a god into that mix, into my understanding what the definition of morality is, it throws the whole thing in a haywire.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Bec-
No, nothing about a god adds any simplicity. or objectivity to morality. Nothing about a God is good for a moral argument. It just isn't.
Yeah, unless the God himself were there orchestrating it, then it would be a different story. But as it stands now, it's always people representing their God, which is just in my case, in my understanding, that's just the people themselves.
Yeah, yeah, vicarious morality. Yeah, 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 yeah. I think that's pretty decent. It's open. Morality is incredibly simple and overly complicated at the same time, if that makes any sense.
But it
Yeah.
also gives the flexibility and the explanatory power to understand why there's different moral intuitions in different regional places, because different people would have different interests and likings and stuff like that. So when it comes to objective morals, there's a lot of there's some things that we largely agree upon in society, but then it starts splintering apart very quickly from those few 3 or 4 that the apologists are always very quick to name, which is always
Right.
murder,
Murder.
something to do with babies, and the R word. It's those 3,
Yeah.
and it's always those 3, and then it's like, well, after that, then it gets very subjective. But
Yeah. And it's difficult to have that conversation with anybody, especially in a YouTube comment section, which is why, by and large, I will just avoid any comments that are on morality, because you cannot say such a thing that the R word is subjectively immoral, because there's so much nuance and caveats that have to go along with that.
well,
But
I agree.
realistically,
Yeah.
even those, like even the big 3, 4 that pretty much most people at least out loud agree on, even that would still be subjective. That it would be immoral to murder somebody. Like you can't prove that concretely, because it's
And yeah,
invented. Yeah.
I think Craig is demonstrating that for us right here and now live.
Yeah. So let me try to. I'm sorry. I meant to hit the pause button and I took us all the way back to the beginning. I have no idea where we
Is
were.
there
Can
a
you just-
chapter heading that says babies or something like that? Because I think that's what we were on, was talking about kids.
Why did wrong? Why does God wrong in the Canaanite slaughter?
It might be
How
there.
can is
Uh,
this slaughter a genocide or not? If Dr. Craig were a Canaanite, conclusion. Let me hit play right where we got Alex, because Alex at least is a much better placeholder than William Lane Craig is. So if he's talking, I think we'll recognize if we've heard it or not.
blessing to these children
shit, he's not.
for them to be killed and
Oh,
go to
perfect.
heaven and be with God.
There you go.
You must understand
Nice.
how that sounds, saying
Divine intervention.
it was a blessing for these children to be killed and go to God. I mean, this is something that Dawkins quotes you on directly, and I'm interested in you share my assessment here that even if he's not correct, I can understand why he would hear you say something like that and think that it's morally repugnant, that it's revolting. In any other context, if somebody says something like, well, maybe the murder of these children, I suppose you wouldn't see it as murder, but the killing of these innocent children is a blessing to them. It just seems, again, to run against our intuitions. I mean, you mentioned
Well, does it, Alex? I mean, I think it runs against our naturalistic worldview, where one doesn't believe in an afterlife. But on a theistic worldview, if these children go to...
So I'm sorry, did William Lane Craig say that under a naturalistic worldview, it is in fact immoral to kill children?
Yeah, it's just weird if you believe in heaven and afterlife, then it gets gross.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree with what he just said, but that's not something that a Christian apologist should ever say out loud. Well, under a naturalistic worldview, sure, it's immoral to kill children, but under a theistic worldview, it might not be immoral. That's essentially what he just said, right?
Yeah, and then if I remember right, he's going to get into abortion, which is the automatic. Like if Ger's still awake, that's the automatic pivot. What about abortion? Like,
yeah, did they go into it?
I think so. Yeah,
okay.
right after this.
All right.
More glorious and happy than they can imagine, then it is a great blessing. It's just that modern man doesn't believe that.
There are
anymore.
a few ways that I would maybe respond to that. The first is to say that there are areas like take the issue of abortion, for example. Now, you might think that it's immoral to have an abortion because God has commanded that you shouldn't take innocent life, in the absence of some specific divine command, sure. But a lot of the time in this discussion, people do talk in language which points to how this is bad for the child. You're taking away the life of a child. You're committing some wrong towards the child. This position that you're advocating here would seem to remove the ability to do that. You can still say that abortion is wrong if you like, but you can't say that it in any way harms the child. In fact, it seems like you're committed to the view that it confers a great good upon the child when a parent has
absolutely.
abortion.
I mean, what it would do would rob the child of the goods of this finite life. That
With that, let him finish the sentence because he's about to wrap it.
It seems like William Lane Craig is about to give his own counter apologetics, because he just said out loud the bad part about the Canaanite children is that the Canaanite children would also have been robbed of all of the things that he just listed.
He would have enjoyed had he lived 50, 60 years or so. But in place of that, it gives him an eternal life of incomprehensible joy and happiness. which far outbalances the loss of those finite goods. So the reason that abortion is wrong is not because it's bad for the victims. The reason it's wrong is because it transgresses a divine command. It's homicide, and God has commanded us not to commit homicide in the absence of some overriding moral justification, like a policeman or a soldier who needs to take life in order to save life. So it gets back again, Alex, to your ethical theory. Whence
I think that was a pretty fair response.
Well, I would just say when I'm hearing that, I think this is the same exact reasoning Andrea Yates is running in her brain when she drowned her children. This is the script that she's running as she's holding their little heads under the water and saying, well, you're just going to be out 50 or 60 years, but you're going to be in heaven forever.
Yeah.
Sickening, dude.
Yeah. No, I don't think I've ever heard a Christian apologist say something that was actually good. But if you take the response at face value, I think that was a relatively good response as to why. I guess he's being consistent with what he's saying in this regard. Abortion would be wrong because you're going against a divine command, which is thou shalt not murder. And the reason that it was okay for the Canaanites to be robbed of that 50 and 60 years is because God said it, so it was good.
No, it makes sense. It all makes sense, and I'm just biting my tongue because I know the juicy part comes up, and it's the question that I'm thinking about. I don't know if you're thinking about is how to tell the difference. And
How do you tell the difference between something that God has commanded?
yeah, and he gets into that, and that's where everything falls apart for me anyway. Maybe JR in the chat, since he seems to be enlightened, can decipher some of this stuff, jibber jabber that he's saying better than I am. But
Yeah. How would you tell the difference between something that's going off in your head, something that's coming from an evil force, something that's coming from God, Yahweh specifically, and something that's coming from a different God?
well, that's the even bigger kicker. They have an ultimate bad guy in this game that they're playing too. So it's not just your own intuitions versus God. It's you also have
Right.
another party who's interested in like actually causing harm to your kids
Yes,
or whatever,
swaying your judgments. Yeah.
which just convolutes it that much more.
Yeah.
do moral obligations arise? And I cannot think of any source for moral obligations more plausible than that these arise as a result of imperatives issued by a qualified authority, in this case, the good himself.
I suppose I have a few things to say. One is that this seems to, you've talked about this in relation to children. The children who get killed, you're conferring a good upon them because they get to go to heaven. But this would surely apply just as much to the adult Canaanites as to the children. I mean, maybe all of the adult.
No, because it was so William Lane Craig's already responded to this. It wouldn't apply to the Canaanite children because God said it, so it was good.
Canaanites were corrupt and evil, but if there were any good people among them, it seems like there would be no need to say, no, how corrupt the society was, because anybody who is innocent and good, if they get killed, well, they get to go to heaven too. So it seems like a bit of a disposal problem. Any time that there's any kind of slaughter which involves this serious challenge of innocent people being put to the sword on the command of a god, you can always just say, well, they go to heaven, so if anything, you've actually done them a favor. It seems like a bit of a disposal problem. Sorry, it's alluded to a disposal problem. It seems like
disposal problem. What do you mean by that?
Like there's sort of this problem of where do these people go? What do we do with these good souls? And we just say, oh well, they just go to heaven. I mean, it seems like a difficult pill to swallow. And what I was wondering is if, despite what your philosophy is, do you understand that intuition? Do you understand why when Richard Dawkins looks at this and thinks it's
myself? It's so powerful. But boy, just to reiterate again,
sorry, not mute. I'm getting angry. I gotta mute.
What is the problem here? The problem is whether or not there is an internal inconsistency in the Judeo-Christian worldview between affirming.
Well, and as we said before, there is an internal inconsistency, and that is that even God sometimes cannot make up his own mind of what is or is not right. I think that argument right there is a defeater for all of this. A God, specifically not Yahweh, this God, the Christian God, the Jewish God, cannot have divine commands. He forfeited his right to divine command when he regretted one of his commands. I think that's a defeater for this argument, is there no longer divine commands because he cannot even tell, even with his omniscience, he cannot tell what is and is not a good command, simply because he regretted many of his commands in the Bible. So I think he's forfeited that.
Can I just remind everybody who was here from earlier is that this is about a land grab, and he already said it's about a land grab, and now it's all about divine justice and punishment, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also about a land grab. So
yeah, it's historically and accurately, it's only about a land grab. But I see,
good and all just, and affirming that God commanded Israel to drive the Canaanites on pain of death out of the land. And so the question is not, are these things true, or did this really happen? It's only a question about, is there an inconsistency between those two propositions? And I think that given a divine command theory of morality, we can see that those propositions are quite consistent with each other. Now, that says nothing about whether or not it's true that when you die, you go to heaven, or that there is immortality beyond the grave, but those beliefs are
Well, Jesus. Okay. The second defeater for this argument would be that yes, it is internally inconsistent, even in or specifically in the Christian worldview, that these whether he's not saying it doesn't he's not saying that this is a true proposition. It just, as long as it's internally consistent, then that's good enough for him. But it isn't internally consistent because of the whole Jesus dying for your sins, and that is the only way you can get into heaven is through Jesus' sacrifice. So that would be the second defeater for this for this argument. These children did nothing of Jesus, and the only way to get into heaven is through Jesus. And again, I know I just said this a bit ago, but it's coming up again here. If you didn't need Jesus to die on the cross to sacrifice himself for your sins, then why did he do that at all? If God had the ability to just grant people to get into heaven in the first place, why the whole Jesus thing? It's not internally consistent, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, let's think of all the loopholes that they give. So there is the baby loophole that some give. There's the gospel hasn't reached them yet loophole that some give. It depends on how you want to read it, but Paul actually talks about women being saved through childbirth. Not many Christians take that seriously, but it's in there, and that would be a loophole about being saved without Jesus. So it's very confusing.
Yeah, I guess I mean then that's the only point is let's just grant these loopholes. It would still be a defeater for the argument because in the cases of those loopholes, you still didn't need Jesus to do this. So yeah, why the whole Jesus thing? If it was unnecessary, I guess. But according to the popular Christian theology, and again, the reason I'm pushing on this so hard is because I just recently did a video on it. Very popular Christian theology is that absolutely you need Jesus. You needed Jesus to die on the cross for people to get into heaven, but clearly that's not the case. It's not internally consistent. I would say that the only way that it could be internally consistent is if these babies didn't go to heaven, and it's a popular apologetic that they're in some type of waiting, purgatory, some type of waiting place. Yeah, limbo. That would be internally consistent until they can be judged, after the second coming and the rapture and all that stuff. That would be internally consistent, I think. But simply saying that they're just in heaven, they just got in, no, that's not internally consistent.
I just want to bring up that JR is a huge fan of yours. I don't know if you know Jerome, but he's funny. Not a huge fan.
And it's not close enough. I mean, if I'm wrong, tell me where I'm wrong.
No, don't, because he will sidetrack the stream in a heartbeat. Okay. So let's get on.
I mean, I'm open for correction, but I promise you, I don't just say stuff. I devote a lot of my time thinking about this kind of stuff and kind of balancing it out in my own head. I don't just say stuff. So if I'm wrong, I would love to know, but I don't think I am. So, all right, let's go.
Part and parcel of the Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview. And so the question is, does the Judeo-Christian worldview have an inner inconsistency here? And although Dawkins himself has never interacted with my theory here, in my debate tour with his comrade Lawrence Krauss in Australia, we talked about this, and Krauss finally admitted that, yes, I had succeeded in showing that there is no inconsistency between these two propositions.
Dawkins quotes an article that you wrote in response to this issue, and I suppose I should read what the point that he pulled out, which summarizes this position here. You said, so whom does God wrong in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites? Right. Not the Canaanite adults, for they were corrupt and deserving of judgment. Not the children, for they inherit eternal life. So who is wronged? Ironically, I think the most difficult part of this whole debate is the apparent wrong done to the Israeli soldiers themselves. Can you imagine what it would be like to have to break into some...
There it is. The people that were most wronged in this whole debacle were the soldiers stabbing the babies. All right, good night, folks. That's all we have.
I mean, I guess I could see where that argument would make sense if what William Lane Craig said. Let's just say that it's true, everything that he's saying, that the babies, they do get into the wonderful, glorious heaven, and then that the evil people were judged correctly. Let's just grant that is true. I would say that that would be a fair argument, because that would be horrific to have to do. They would have to live with that, I guess.
So, fortunately, this is not the first time I've heard this statement. I had a Christian counselor I was seeing at some point, and we started talking about this kind of stuff, and he's a psychologist, or at least has his degree, and he's having his familiarity with PTSD and all that type of stuff, so he knows, and he said the same type of stuff. But he had more imagination than Craig did, because he said to me that I think God psychically shielded the Israeli soldiers in order for them to prevent the atrocities, to spare them from the mental and psychological damage that they were going to have to go through. And
Sure.
I was like, okay, that sounds good to me, bro.
Yeah, I guess,
uh,
yeah.
but
Mm.
at least he was more imaginative. Like Craig's like, well, they were hurt. Well, not if you're gonna just institute God magic. Then he could have just like Professor X'd them and gave him
Yeah.
amnesia, or just made them moist robots for a couple days, and they wouldn't even know.
Moist robots. Speaking of that, real quick, I can't remember what video. I think it was a cross-examined video. There is a YouTube person with the uh, channel name Moist Robot, and it made me think of you when I linked the. Or I didn't link the video. I told him you do a YouTube search of B.S. Lewis Moist Robots if you want a good kick.
Oh yeah,
Um,
that's a classic. It's one of my old ones, but it's a good one.
yeah. Oh, it's so funny. I can't. Oh man. All right. Yeah. Let's not get too sidetracked. But that
All right.
video's. Oh man. Every time I watch it, it never gets old. It's hilarious.
House and kill a terrified woman and her children. The brutalizing effect on these Israeli soldiers is disturbing. I must say that the disturbing thing to me there is I can't shake this feeling. And like I say, I have respect for you as a thinker and a philosopher, and I always enjoy our conversations. But hearing somebody talking about the slaughter of admittedly and explicitly innocent children, not to mention animals, as well as the eradication, driving out
Look at that
of an entire
smile.
society, and to say that
Yeah.
It's like, well, now it's starting to turn into a little grimace, but before it was just like, I'm beaming at this. Like, I'm so proud of myself with my logical philosophy.
Yeah, at least he doesn't have the toothy smile going on right now, as he did in like the beginning parts of this. It was just, I don't know. There's something about it. It's unsettling.
It's true. It's
well,
definitely my thumbnail on this one.
people who
Oh,
really
yeah.
suffered here were the soldiers who had to kill the innocent woman. It just, in a way that I said at the very beginning of this segment, there's nothing I can do strictly speaking to prove that this is that there's no justification for this. But if there is anything that I've ever heard in my life that jumps out of a page with pure
There's-
moral repugnance in the way that it meets my ears, it
Yeah.
has to be something like that.
Well, I really thought hard and dispassionately about this, Alex, and I tried to think as hard as I could, who has been wronged in this action? And it's very difficult to think of anyone who has been wronged by God in commanding this. And then it hit me, well, what about the Israeli soldiers themselves? Because we do know from soldiers.
Real quick, I also want to point out that we're skipping over an entire group of people here. I mean, you have the adults, and then they're talking about the babies and the children. But I mean, you still have like teenagers, and like, what about them who I guess would be within the age of reason, but also wouldn't be at the age that they would be committing supposed atrocities? Like, what about that group of people?
Okay, well, that's why I would bring up too. He's focusing on the Canaanites. My last video went specifically to the Midianites, and the Midianites has to keep the virgins for yourself. What about the PTSD of a virgin kept alive? Like, oh, you get to shave your head and mourn for a month, but then you're just like married off to the guy who killed your family.
Mhm.
It's like, I would say that they're pretty psychologically, traumatized. Like they would be a good candidate if you thought dispassionately about this, as you said, William.
Yeah. Yeah, I've
Yeah.
heard some very terrible, terrible responses to that as well. It gets, man, like Christian apologists and people who have spent at least some amount of time thinking about the Old Testament, because a lot of Christians will just, they, you know what I mean, they just won't even like, what do you mean the Old Testament? I don't care about the Old Testament. But you do get the group of Christians who have put some amount of time thinking about this, and it gets really gross, the stuff that they say in defense of some of these, some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Who suffer from.
For good people to be bad, it takes religion.
Or at least to defend terrible things that in no other circumstance they would defend. It definitely takes religion to do that.
PTSD, that the brutalizing effects of war upon soldiers is terrible and can be destructive. And so I explore at some length, what about the wrong done to these soldiers who had to carry out this command? Is there any motivation that might justify giving such a command to them? In the original article, I suggest that yes, indeed, there are goods that would be achieved by having them carry out this command, and that God would have morally sufficient reasons for doing that. That's in my original question of the week, number 16, if people are interested in following it up, where I argue that, in fact, even the soldiers themselves would not be wronged by God issuing such a command. But I was looking for anybody that God had wronged. And, the atheist.
Real quick, did he give a reason why he thinks even the soldiers weren't wronged? Or did I miss that? Or did he just kind of glaze over it by saying he doesn't think they were wronged?
I think it was a glaze because it's just the presupposition that God can't be wrong.
So he's okay. So, but he did openly acknowledge that there was a lot of psychological harm that could come from this. But it seems like what he said was there's a lot of psychological harm, but I still don't think that they were wronged. Did I miss a reason, or did he just say it?
You can rewind. It's probably mysterious ways, though.
I'll just go back just a couple of, where do we at?
Week number 16, if people are interested in following it up, where I argue that, in fact, even the soldiers themselves would not be wronged by God issuing such a command. But I was looking for anybody that God had wronged. And,
Okay.
the atheist philosopher,
All right.
um,
He was
So
just
he
saying
just he
read
just
his other
plays dumb.
paper or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
he has another
Maybe it
paper.
doesn't put further over there, but okay.
British philosopher Daniel Came, responding to this sort of tiff between Dawkins and me, he said, I think that even though I'm not a Christian, he said Craig's position is entirely reasonable, that the children are not wronged in eternal life. We're all going to die. Someday, many children do die, and God's taking the life of these children prematurely doesn't commit a wrong against them. It's actually, they're good. Now, don't let any
Man. Okay. Just real quick. Even if even if you were to grant that as true, it would still be a wrong against them to have them slaughtered, right? Like even if they got the eternal life and had they been allowed to go through adulthood, they would have been denied that eternal life. Like, I mean, there's still a more moral way to do this, right? Like God could have just, snapped
Poof.
his fingers and took them instead of having them be, who only knows how they were actually slaughtered, bashed against a
Yeah.
stone or stabbed or slow. We don't. There's still a more moral way to do this.
And
So
this is the whole heart of my issue with all these atrocity stories is God has not shown an inability to handle business by himself. There's the flood, obviously. There's also like swallowing people in the earth. I'm sure there's other means he's actually personally executed his justice. But the moral factor, as I described morality before, because I see it as a social agreement, a social contract, social whatever for behavior between two individuals, that gets hurt the moment that he says, "Hey, I need you to kill this other person." Because there's absolutely no reason that he needs them to kill that other person when he could have poofed everybody out of the Holy
yeah,
Lands and just had an empty land there waiting for the
yeah,
Israelites to show up.
yeah, yeah. That kind of brings a thought. And if JR is still in the chat, don't hold me to this because it's just popped in my head. But it's with what you just said. It's almost like God wanted to find the most immoral way to perform this moral action through some type of brutal slaughter. I'll have to think that one through a little bit. But
Yeah, and I don't buy the whole it's infinity is a reward for this stuff because JR is just putting this up here too. He's like, oh, we're dumb because we're not understanding how infinity works. Do you understand how infinity works, JR? It's an abstract concept. It doesn't actually exist. Like, could you tell me how many divisions you can make between the number 1 and 2? Like, would you say infinity? Because technically you could, even though it's bookended by a beginning and an end.
yeah,
What I would say is that go read Genesis 3:22. Watch my video from a couple of videos back on God didn't want them to have eternal life in the first place. That's why he kicked them out of the garden. And so when we start assuming that this is just the coverall for like killing babies and stuff, double check the Bible, make sure that God actually wants you to have eternal life in the first place, and then get back to me about it.
yeah. And just to be clear, like I think both of us understand very thoroughly how the theory works. Um, we're disagreeing with it.
Everybody say, oh, well, then we ought to go kill children. No, that would transgress a divine command against homicide. And therefore, in the absence of a divine command, that would be morally wrong. It is only given this divine command from the paradigm of goodness itself that one would be morally obligated to carry out such a horrific action.
But look, one of the things that Randall Ralston talks about as well is this example of someone who in 2004 committed infanticide, killed her own child,
Yes,
says that she did so because she believed God was commanding her to. Now, it will be
right.
easy enough to just
All right,
say,
pause.
I just don't think God was commanding her to. But the question I want to ask is,
This is where it's going to get into the good part, and I'm going to have a lot to say. But I just want to brace everybody in the chat because this is where rubber hits the road on this moral theory.
given everything you just said, how can we know this? Because generally, if I ask
Yes.
somebody, look, if God told you to shoot up a primary school, would you do it? And what they tend to say is something like, well, I wouldn't believe that was God because that runs against his nature. The problem is
Yes.
that, sure, you might want to say that, just asking a mother to kill her child for no apparent reason might run against God's nature. It just seems to me that intuitively, if we didn't have this story in the Hebrew Bible, if the story of the Canaanites didn't exist, and we were speaking in a hypothetical, and I said, well, what if God told you to, I don't know, walk into somebody's land and not just drive them out, but if they refuse to go, to kill them, and then come back and kill the women and kill the children, and in fact, kill the animals too. And if they leave the animals, they get punished for not killing the animals as well. What if he told you to do something like that? And I imagine the only thing somebody would be able to say is that, well, of course God wouldn't tell me to do that. And that's how I know that I wouldn't want to follow that command. But that's exactly what's happening here. So it leads us to a radical moral skepticism, in other words, is Rouse's critique.
Oh, I don't think it does that. But notice what you're raising here now is an epistemological question, not a metaethical question. This is now no longer a question about whether or not it would be right or even obligatory to carry out such a command. The question now you're raising is an epistemic question about how could I be
Pause.
sure that God hasn't.
This is the title of the stream, folks, because we all know that Bill Craig drops his epistemic bar on the floor. So he can metaphysically preach his theories about divine command theory all day long, but when it comes into practice, which is why morality exists in the first place, it's not like, how should I treat you? It's actually treating the person a certain way. This is going to fall apart really quickly, and he's not going to have any good answers because he's suffering from the same problem as his epistemic blunder from Apologia's meme from 2022 when it comes to his moral theory. There is no good way to put it into practice without actually like maybe really fucking up the world on whole on a large scale if people all adapted this as a large scale practice. Thoughts, Nara?
I mean, yeah, kind of well said. I'm unfamiliar with the Apologia.
Did you see
Was it a video?
my Christmas video? Do you see that? The Candy King
Uh,
Craig. The whole last section was me just dubbing over that blender, and I just made it him as a Candy King saying it, and I replaced I
I do
replaced
remember.
everything with God as Santa Claus and Christmas.
I do remember the specifics of it though. Man, I need to maybe I'll start branching out a little bit. Maybe I'll start listening to other people weigh in on the.
Sorry, I thought it was that popular. Maybe I didn't know I had the only person
You know,
who had seen it.
I'm sure it is. No, it's. I mean, I'm sure it's probably great. And it's it just like I said before, listening to other people talk about it's just not fun for me to listen to somebody say a bunch of stuff that I'm almost certainly going to agree with already.
No, I agree with that. I go to
But
Christian chats all the time.
yeah, see, that's fun.
Yeah, it is a good time.
Oh.
All right.
In fact, issued such a command. And in the case that you mentioned of Andrea Yates, this was a severely mentally disturbed woman who.
Okay, prove it, I guess, or I guess not prove that she was mentally ill. Given the fact that she was mentally ill, how do you decipher that command in fact did not come from God, or that she, or would William Lane Craig say that what she did was the good thing, kind of what we were saying earlier?
It depends if God told her to or not. But my question would also be, how did he determine that like Abraham wasn't mentally ill, or any of these Bible people? So he's okay. I'm gonna spoil it, but yeah, keep going.
Who was hearing voices and was schizophrenic. And it might well be the case that epistemically, Alex, that no one would be justified today in thinking that God had issued such a command. It would be plausible to think that they ought to conclude that, in fact, they're hallucinatory or schizophrenic or mentally ill and go see a counselor. But that's an epistemic question about how did God communicate his revelation to Joshua and these Old Testament Israelites in such a self-authenticating way that there was no doubt that this was being commanded to them.
It is an
It may have
epistemic
been
question.
Also, one of the most famous things that Bill Craig talks about is that if every evidence and argument failed against Christianity, he would still know it's true because of the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit.
Divine
And
revelation.
so his whole faith in Christianity lives and dies and depends mainly on this self-authenticating communication with an outside external divine force.
Yeah.
And that's fine. Like if you are on your own and you want to have a trip with God and you're thinking that's fine. But the story changes dramatically once morality is involved. Once we have two or more people involved, like Andrea Yates maybe having that same self-authenticating feeling that he also thinks he has, which he's also denied in Mormons, by the way, because he'll say, well, obviously, like their stuff is so fake, they can't be having these self-authenticating experiences. But it's like it's them. It's the Spider-Man meme when they're just pointing at each other and be like, no, you don't have it. And was he to tell that Andrea Yates did not have that self-authenticating inner voice that he talks about with himself? And then how would he condemn her for doing what she did, because he's already admitting it would be the right thing to do if she had an overriding moral command to do so.
And on top of that, he would argue that she. Okay, no, I'm wrong.
But this is it's all a very big problem, and he's admitting it. It's an epistemic problem. Like the epistemology here is God awful, horrible garbage. He could have the right view metaphysically, fine. Like, but who cares about if you have the right metaphysical moral view? Like, if morality involves communication and interaction between two people, the most important part is the epistemology, is playing it out, is putting it into action. So I don't care what you have to say about your metaphysical framework. Like he can believe that this is all right and good till the cows come home. I could give two shits less. But if he starts acting like it, and that's where the problem comes into play. If he starts acting out his metaphysical beliefs in an epistemological action, that's when it becomes troublesome for everybody else.
Yeah, which they do all the time.
And that's the whole argument we're talking about with, because he thinks this is a real historical event that really happened and real people really interacted with each other and did these things because of divine command theory. So it's a hypothetical at this point because, like we said, we don't really believe this actually happened. But as you also said earlier, this has more modern day implications.
Yeah. It's it's difficult, especially because we're covering about 40 minutes of this video. But if you just go, I wish it were easier to kind of piece together every time William Lane Craig has refuted himself. And I think you just pretty much summed it up very nicely about at every turn he kind of every time he gives his own counter arguments, he moves into a different argument, starting with the land grab, then the morality argument. Yeah. Well, maybe we can get through this.
It is an epistemic question here, but I suppose what I'm pointing out is an implication of this view, which is that, at the very least, if I were to hear a very convincing voice tonight telling me to go and murder children in a primary school tomorrow, and I fully believed it was the voice of God when I woke up and I couldn't shake it, I could say, look, maybe I should go and get tested for. I feel fine. I feel rational. I seem rational. Maybe I should go and see if there's something wrong with my brain. But the one thing I can no longer do, I think, is say something like, no, I must be going crazy, because God would never tell me to do something like that. I'd have to at least consider the possibility God actually is telling me to go and do something like that, because there are instances in the Hebrew Bible where God does tell people to go and kill innocent children, and you would say justifiably so. So I'm removed of that ability. Know for sure that I'm deluded.
Yes. Well, it's true that it would be possible, but as I say, there's nothing in the argument for the consistency of these propositions that would imply that anyone would ever be justified in believing that they had received such a command, because it would go against what our normal objective moral duties are. As you say, we have strong moral.
So does this apply to the ancient Israelites?
Yeah, it's just modern day apparently, and it doesn't even include his own Holy Spirit encounters that he talks about. And so he's even cutting his own inner verification of the Holy Spirit, whatever he calls it. He's cutting it down at the knees.
Yeah, let me hold on. I want to hear him say that again.
Nothing in the argument for the consistency of these propositions that would imply that anyone would ever be justified in believing that they had received such a command.
That anyone would ever be justified in believing that they had such a command.
Then why the hell does the command exist in the first place? Why is he advocating for divine command theory if nobody is justified in believing they're getting divine commands? It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it goes to what I literally just said. If we could only get a cohesive group of clips every time William Lane Craig defeated his own arguments. I'm going to clip that out. I mean, he was a complete defeater to everything he said, right?
Yeah, that's how I hear it.
I mean, everyone.
Nothing in the argument for the consistency of these propositions that would imply that anyone would ever be justified in believing that they had received such a command, because it would go against what our normal objective moral duties are. As you
But
he wants to save that moral argument so bad. He wants that moral argument to be safe, but he knows that if he does this, it won't be an argument.
Yeah, wow. And maybe he will say something past that point that kind of saves that argument, but I would say that he just defeated his entire argument in this whole video by saying that nobody would ever be justified in believing that they had actually received such a command. And he said anyone ever.
I just want to tell JR, if we have prerequisites of this happening in the Bible, then there's nothing saying it. It puts possibility on the table. It might still be a low probability, but it's not an impossibility. So, and that's what Alex O'Connor is saying, is that we already have prerequisites written in the Bible, or that's not the right word, prerequisite. It's something else, but it examples of this being done. And so, for you to say, or if anybody to say, like, well, that's just Old Testament, like, makes it subjective and arbitrary, which doesn't make morality objective anyway.
Yeah, maybe he'll save it. But if you say that, I want to recap this real quick, because I think this is probably the most important point that's come up in this video. If you start off with saying that you have a set of moral laws, and in this case, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder, then the only way that murder could be justified is if it comes from a divine command. Then it now becomes a moral command because God said it, so it's moral. And then later in the video to say that you have no way to ever know that you actually got said command. Yeah.
And he's just about to get into it, where he says that you're not justified in disobeying commands if you get these commands either. So he also, like, I'll let you get to that point, but he also just flips the script and contradicts himself again. It
gets hard to keep up with everything he's saying. He's saying so little, and yet everything he says, you can have like a 20-minute breakdown of it because it's so stupid.
Say we have strong moral intuitions that taking innocent life is morally wrong. And so for us to believe that God is commanding us to do that would require just incredible, overwhelming justification. And it may well be the case that nobody today would have such a thing. That's just, I'm not interested in defending that epistemic question.
Just to be clear, where you said it's possible, you mean it?
I don't want to answer that. Is that what he just said?
would have such a thing. That's just, I'm not interested in defending that epistemic question.
I bet you aren't.
Yeah, it
Jesus,
must be
wow.
convenient.
I don't want it. I don't want to answer that. I'm not going to answer that. That's a defeater for my entire argument. Therefore,
Yeah.
You said it's possible. You mean
Well,
it
that's what's
is
funny.
possible,
It's funny
even if
because he's like, Lawrence Krauss said that I don't have any holes in my argument, and then you get to this part, and he's like, well, I don't have any holes in my argument because I refuse to answer that part of the argument.
right? Yeah, man.
as you say, the epistemic question is a separate thing. Whether we can know this is the case, it is possible that God could command something so intuitively immoral as walking into a primary school and shooting it up or something. It's possible that he could command such a thing.
Well,
It would be
I would-
consistent with his
I would-
nature, in other words.
Yeah, is it possible? I mean, that one seems to me to be plausibly contrary to his moral nature, but it is.
Yeah, I don't think I like that the counter from Alex, because while it might be plausible, I guess what would the justification be for walking into a primary school and shooting and doing that? Whereas with the Canaanites, at least you have the whole animal thing, the child
Maybe.
sacrifice thing.
Maybe God just wants the land that the skull's built on.
Okay, yeah, I guess that's it. So okay,
I want to
So-
build a church.
I think a better counter from Alex would have been, what if in the Gaza Strip, God commanded the Israelite soldiers to go in and unalive all of the children? I think that would have been a fair example. She would have gone with that, because simply walking, I don't think there's, as AR said, yes, precedent. I don't think there's precedent for God not having any justification. It's just not a good justification. But yeah, if the primary school was on a land that was promised by God to the Israelites, yeah, I would have went with that.
Well, okay, so I'm going to take this a weird other angle because he likes to argue with the infinites, right? Oh, we're sacrificing 60 years of a life to go for infinite life. Isn't in the same reasoning, all that land is finite too? So the Holy Land is finite. The school we're talking about would be finite, and then be like, well, we're going to kill these people and we're going to give them infinite land. And so it's like you still use the same type of argument, and it sounds absurd because it is absurd, but like honestly, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It is possible for God to issue commands that would override what our moral duties are. So,
Sure.
yeah, I would say that it is possible, but that's not to say that anyone would ever be justified in believing it.
Now, a final line of questioning here.
Okay, so double down on. I mean, am I missing something here? It seems so stupid for him to say that out loud that it seems like I have to be wrong.
Rewind.
It's so obviously wrong. He just doubled down on the fact that nobody would ever be justified in believing that they received such a command from a God as to kill a child. I think I went too far,
Yeah.
but
Now, a final line of
That anyone would are. So,
Sure.
yeah, I would say that it is possible, but that's not to say that anyone would ever be justified in believing it.
Now, a final line.
yeah, I mean, that's you as an apologist, you should never say that out loud
Yeah.
unless I'm missing something. It's so obviously incorrect that it seems like maybe I'm just misinterpreting what he's saying. But from what I gather, he's saying anyone ever, as he said just a moment ago, which would include the Israelites and the Canaanites and the Midianites and all the other ites, even they would not have had a justification for believing that they actually received such a command.
Yeah, there's no reason for it to not go backwards in time too, but he will again. Like you keep anticipating what he's going to talk about. This is kind of cool because it
Well-
shows you're seasoned at this.
I've heard the arguments a time or two, but he specifically said anyone ever would include would it not?
Yeah, none of this actually has anything to do with morality, and that's the shocker that he's going to get into towards the end here.
Line of questioning here, because I know the time is short, is specifically about the accusation that this is apology for genocide. I've heard that when people ask you about this and they say the
Yes.
genocide of the Canaanites, you don't like description, to put it lightly, of what happened here. But I'll tell you
Real quick, that's 100% accurate description. It's genocide apologetics. There's no other way around it. It is. Now, whether or not you believe that because I mean, genocide isn't inherently immoral, I guess you would say, at its face, but it's genocide nonetheless.
why I think it might be a suitable descriptor here. Okay, because
I guess you could say that it was a good genocide, which it does not exist, but under his view, it would be a genocide. It would just be a moral one.
the language of the Hebrew Bible is quite extreme in saying that we should be destroying them completely and leaving nothing alive that breathes. Now, you have pointed out that God actually does say to drive them out. And
Right.
it does seem that after these military campaigns, there are still Canaanites who are alive. But yeah,
Right.
it does seem to me that, for instance, on the issue of driving out, well, if we look first at Deuteronomy, where God says, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving to you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. And then it lists a number of peoples, including the Canaanites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they teach you to follow detestable things, and so on. It says, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Destroy them completely. Now, maybe that the Israelites failed to do so, but it seems like the commandment is clear. Now, where it says to chase them out, I have in Joshua chapter 8, when Israel had finished killing all the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all of the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. So it seems here that, yes, they were chased out,
mic drop.
but the Israelites then chased.
Mic drop.
Yeah.
It's not about getting the land. It's about chasing them down and killing them.
Yeah. Yeah. I've brought that verse up quite a few times too. Just it is a genocide. I'm curious what William Lane Craig would have to say about it. Would he bring up what's common counter apologetics for this, or apologetics for the genocide? Is that, I don't know. We'll see what he has to say. Is he going to say that it wasn't an ethnic cleansing? It was for the land?
No, that's not his ultimate justification. Like, he flip-flops between those, the justice, the ethnic cleansing, the land, but he will tell the real story.
Okay.
Tell the truth.
All right.
After them, once they'd been removed from the city, killed them out in the wilderness, turned around, came back, killed everyone else who was left in the city, and who would that have been? It would have been the women, the children, the disabled, etc. So it seems to me that even if we have, God saying that you just need to chase them out, and even if, they don't end up in practice all being killed, it still seems like this could be described as at least an attempted genocide against the Canaanites.
Well, I don't think it is an attempted genocide, because if they would flee and leave the land, the judgment of God would be accomplished and satisfied. As I say, the judgment.
Okay, but that's still a genocide. I think, and I don't fault William Lane Craig for this, because many people are under this assumption, but even driving them out of their land and dispersing them would constitute, even if not a single person was killed, and I already said this, but it's coming around again, even if not a single person was killed, the simple displacement of an entire people group is still a genocide.
Was to destroy these
definitionally, it is a genocide.
Kingdoms as nation states by divesting them of the land, and the land was being given over to Israel. It wasn't important that all of these people be exterminated because of their race.
Oh, geez. Okay, so he did go into race. I figured that was going to come up, but how can William Lane Craig not see this as a genocide? If you don't leave, we're going to kill you. Many did not leave. Many were killed, and many were displaced.
Well, it's not just that. He's leaving out a verse where it says part of this peace offering isn't just to leave; it's to become their slaves. And so I put that in my video. It's in Deuteronomy, I think, but it's very opening.
If you march upon the gates, and you make them an offer of peace, and they accept your offer of peace, then they will be subject to forced labor, not indentured servitude, as a lot of apologetics. I can't remember which one's the slave, the abed or whatever, but it's the actual slave one. They'll be subject to forced labor. Also, it's like if the entire people were not eradicated, specifically because of a specific trait of that people, whether it be their race, their gender, their religion, whatever, if it wasn't based on some type of characteristic of a people group, and every single person of that people group were not killed, according to William Lane Craig, then it just wasn't a genocide. But
it makes it sound like they're just going to go move to another area and start a new life, and that's not really biblically accurate. So
it's not biblically accurate, for starters. Many people were killed. In many cases, it gives the number of people that were killed or enslaved, and also given to God as bounty, spoils of war. I don't know what God would do with these people, but in every definition, a genocide was completed. I guess what I'm saying is, I wish William Lane Craig would kind of go back to what he was saying before, that yes, they were killed, but it wasn't immoral because it was a divine command. He should just say that, like, yeah, it was a genocide, but it was a moral one because God commanded it. At least that would be consistent. He's just denying genocide right now.
Yeah, he's just waffling on it.
Yeah.
Or ethnicity. That wasn't the point. Rather, it was that none of them were to be left in the.
Wasn't race-based slavery. It wasn't race-based genocide. Jesus.
Land. The land was to be cleansed of these people by driving them all out or killing those who remain behind. The point was that there were. Are you enjoying this video so far?
Well,
I told you that this is what you're in for when you come for this.
Yeah. Okay. I would like to write, what are we at? 57:53. So let's go back. 57:41. Okay. I would like to write Merriam-Webster a letter and see if they disagree with this definition of genocide. Okay, hold on. Let me collect my thoughts here. It's getting a tad frustrating to hear just complete genocide denial. Pull up the definition of a genocide and tell me that what William Lane Craig, what he's about to say, how it does not meet that definition. He's going to give a very, and actually a very good definition of genocide. This is a good definition of genocide, what he's about to say.
And the land was to be cleansed of these people by driving them all out or killing those who remain behind. The point was that there were
There
to be
you go.
none of
That's a
these.
definition. That's a good definition of genocide. Driving people out of a land and killing those left behind. That's a great definition.
Except for
How does he not
virgins.
see this?
Yeah, except for virgins, they're immune from all this evil for some reason.
Yeah, well, I mean, even still, that still falls under the definition, because you're taking them, and eventually, either the virgin that was taken to be married off or whatever, enslaved, either that virgin would assimilate into the Israelite culture, which, by the way, would have been great to do with those babies. Just take the babies and then assimilate them into your culture instead of killing them and bring them closer to God. But even that falls under the definition of genocide, a cultural cleansing. If you assimilate them into your culture and that culture no longer exists, every single turn it 100% meets the definition of genocide. And he's literally saying, well, no, it doesn't.
Well, I would say that Alex is keeping a cool face. Like we're getting into the heat parts of this, and he's like,
It's a very, yeah.
I think he has one of those stress squeeze balls that he's probably squeezing off the strings.
He's just pumping it. He's gone through like 6 of them right now, because even though they're like self-inflating, there's like 4 of them down there that are just permanently squished.
Yeah.
It's left in the land.
But in the case of Ai, it seems at least implied here that even after chasing them out, they've been chased out into the field and in the wilderness where they had chased them, it says, and every one
Yes,
of them
that's very
put to the
interesting.
sword. And so it seems to me
Yeah.
that you've kind of got chasing these people out of the land and then chasing after them and killing them and then coming back to kill everybody else.
Yeah, I take it that this was the aftermath of a battle, and that they pursued the retreating forces and destroyed them. So this was part of a resistance movement on the part of these Canaanite peoples, and the aftermath of a battle.
I guess it seems to me like if a moment ago you say, well, they didn't have to die because they were given the opportunity to leave.
Right.
And here's an instance where, well, they do leave, but they get killed anyway.
Well, yeah, but only after being in a pitched battle against.
Well, yeah, technically, yeah, they did die, didn't they?
Yeah. Well,
Fuck, dude.
well, sure, they were slaughtered, but only after they surrendered. Like, well, okay.
After the retreating armies to eliminate that, very different than people seeing the Israeli forces advancing and vacating the cities and leaving the land. If they did that, nobody had to die. So
How does he know that?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Scripturally, back this up. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't recall the entirety of the Bible here, but
I've heard that
there's a single verse.
Okay, this is where it gets muddy, because I've heard, like, if you talk to some Christians, they'll have this weird parsing out of like what God commanded and what the people did, and they would say, well, God commanded them to kill the cities, but the Israel who chased after the Ai people, they were acting on their own accord, and that's not exactly what God wanted. And it's like, well, where are you coming up with that?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
But it's
Yeah,
just these really hard topics, and all this stuff really flies in the face of the love your neighbor, love your enemy, Jesus stuff, and it becomes like a really cognitive dissonance inducer.
Yeah, yeah.
they were to cleanse the land of these people by either driving them out or exterminating those who were still trying to stay.
So you, Dr. Craig, are a
Yes.
Canaanite.
Another cohesive definition of genocide: either driving them out or killing them if they stay. Yeah, we
All right,
call it genocide.
So if Craig were a Canaanite, now we're getting into the role playing here. And the first line he says makes me laugh actually really hard, but it's like not funny, but it does make me laugh.
You wake up and you find yourself
Yeah.
in the land, and through essentially accident of birth, you've been born into a community that has raised you to have quite immoral tendencies and practices. You're surrounded by all kinds of sin, and you engage in it yourself.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
a-
Don't make me sound like an innocent victim. If I'm one of them, I am an incredibly evil and reprobate person.
I suppose there's a whole other question which we don't have time to go into about the fact that being born into such a
Okay,
society
pause.
might be a little unfair if it almost.
He's like, all right, well, if we're gonna do this hypothetical, you got to assume that I'm the worst of the worst. Like I'm someone who's a piece of shit. But
Yeah.
also, I thought all people were pieces of shit. Like in Christian theology, everyone's a sinner. Like no one's righteous, no, not one. And so we have this. Well, how are you going to tell the difference between the unrighteous people? Because on your theology, every single person is unrighteous, and in some theology versions of it, all sins are equal. So a jaywalker is as bad as a child diddler or
Yeah,
whatever. Like,
and I've heard that argument before, but that was a nice preamble. He's, what if you were a Canaanite? And he's like, you mean what if I were killing puppies and bringing sheep? And like, well, calm down. Like, what if you were just a Canaanite child or
Yeah.
something? That,
Yeah, what if you're just like a normal person, Craig, not a
Yeah.
freak of nature?
Jesus.
necessitates you become an immoral person. But the question I wanted to ask is, suppose you are such a person, right? A foreign nation is approaching with their swords and they say to you, leave this land or we're going to put you to the sword. My question to you is, are you justified? Is it justified for you to fight back?
I mean, ultimately, it's not justified because it would be transgressing a divine command, and therefore wouldn't be justified. But I could well understand again how epistemically one might feel justified in resisting this foreign army. Though I hope that if I were in such a condition, I would have the good sense to get out.
In that case, do you think that Richard Dawkins, to wrap this up, to come full circle, is being completely irrational or understandably wrong, or maybe there's some truth in it if his worldview is correct? Where do you land in terms of what he's doing when he makes this response, hearing everything you say, and say, I just don't want anything to do with you? Where do you think?
I mean, well, there's a lot of levels on which we can answer this. I think
he's a big chicken. He's a big chicken.
Yeah, I will give it to, I think William Lane Craig answered that pretty cohesively. He's saying that in the moment he would have felt justified, but in the grand scheme of things, no, he would not have been justified. It's a fair response. It's at least coherent.
This just causes paralysis by analysis. Like, how is anybody supposed to make decisions in his worldview?
Mhm.
Because if you really think that like God talked to you, but you also have moral intuitions to do the opposite, you will freeze up. Like, he'll say, do this, but I think God wants me to do this opposite thing. And so if you're living your life like that, I'm just gonna put it on steroids and take it to the extreme, like, and say every decision is a moral decision. You will just be a carrot. You'll just be a comatose person who's unable to take any action on anything because you won't know what to do, morally speaking.
Yeah, but paralysis by analysis. I like that. It's good.
My position on the Canaanite conquest was God's gift to Richard Dawkins, because it enabled him to find an excuse for not debating me that gave him the moral high ground. Whereas his other previous excuses, like that I'm a creationist, or he's busy, or it would look good on my resume but not on his, all of those many, many excuses fall flat. But this one, you see, gave him the moral high ground for refusing to engage, and therefore was very convenient for him. Having said that, I think
it probably was convenient for him, because there's no, what's the debate to be had here? I don't even know how you would go about debating this against William Lane Craig. If you said, hey, killing babies or killing children is immoral, and William Lane Craig says, I agree, unless a God says to. I mean, where do you even go from there?
Well, I don't even know if that's the type of debate I want to see between those two, because Dawkins is a biologist. He's a science dude. He's not a moral philosopher or any of this stuff. And to his credit, WLC knows a little bit about science because he has to use it in his cosmological arguments and stuff like that. I wouldn't say he's on the same level as Dawkins, because obviously he's an evolutionary biologist, but he's not. Like, the better debate would be something centered around science, not moral philosophy of ancient biblical texts. Like, that's not going to be in Richard Dawkins' wheelhouse.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I'm just trying I'm trying to think about what I would say in this, and unless you can convince William Lane Craig that God doesn't exist, there's nowhere to go. There's no debate to be had at all. I mean, if God says it's good, then it's good.
Yes, I would say I think Craig is kind of correct that this is not the best dodge by Dawkins, but Dawkins has weird standards. Like, he also says he'll never debate young Earth creationists and stuff like that. So he seems to be rather picky and choosy about his debate partners, and that's his prerogative. That's his prerogative to do so. But if it's not a debate on anything moral, philosophy, or anything, then I don't see a reason why not to take it.
Yeah, that's fair.
It's entirely understandable why one would be troubled by this. I remember when I first heard Philip Quinn, a philosopher at the University of Notre Dame, speak on divine command morality and these cases in the Old Testament. It made me feel terribly uncomfortable. I mean, it is very difficult. But as a philosopher, I'm required to say what I think about something, not how I feel about it. And when I dispassionately weigh meta-ethical theories about the sources of moral obligation and prohibition, I can't think of any other moral theory that better grounds objective moral values and duties than divine command morality. And I think the naturalist is bereft of any basis for affirming the objectivity of moral values and duties. And that theory...
And we come full circle to the you don't have any grounding for your objective morality.
Yeah, which I don't think he grounds it well if he has this mysterious
Mhm.
figure who can just override the objective grounding for morality at any point. That's like,
Yeah,
how is that well grounded? That's even worse off because like it's mysterious ways on steroids, and we also have mental problems as a species, and we have people drowning their kids in bathtubs because they think that your God's telling them to do this. But you're just like asserting and insisting that they're wrong, but you're right when you have an intertestimony with the Holy Spirit. And so like I don't,
right.
this doesn't work any
Yeah.
better at all.
And it gets just a little bit worse than that when you hold that on morality, divine command theory, while simultaneously admitting that you don't have any justification for believing that you're getting such a divine command.
That is probably the biggest kicker. Yes, that's the Achilles heel to this whole talk and
Yeah,
argument.
yeah, it really is. It really is. I mean, God having his own regrets, which would completely counteract him even having the ability to give a divine command, that hurts the argument quite a bit. God granting people the ability to go to heaven pre-Jesus, which means you don't actually need Jesus. God can let you into heaven without Jesus. It hurts the argument. But saying that divine command theory is your grounding for morality while acknowledging that you have no reason to believe such divine commands are or justified is that's the feeder for the argument. Absolutely. And he gave it. It came
Yeah,
from William Lane Craig.
he saw it, he acknowledged it, and he ignored it.
Yeah. Well, he doubled down on it, really.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, geez. Okay.
Theory has the implication, it seems to me, that since God doesn't issue commands to himself, that he isn't bound by the same sort of moral rules and duties that we are. That doesn't mean that he's completely unconstrained. Rather, the constraints on what he commands must be imposed by his own perfectly just and loving nature.
Maybe this is just me, but has it been bothering you or anybody else this that I have not stopped looking at whatever is going on. Does he need chapstick or does he have cotton mouth? The entire debate, that's all I've been able to look at. Or is that just my
I don't know.
is that just me?
I
Sorry.
think that's just you.
Yeah, literally from one, I guess at least minute 18 that I can verify. He's had this going on and about like wipe away or do something. I don't know.
He's getting old. You can't really get on him too much.
Yeah. That's what it looks like is kind of that old man dribble.
Shingles.
Oh boy.
And therefore, it would be impossible.
Yeah, no, that's what that is. He needs to wipe because it's now it's reached his entire top lip. I know it's a side tangent, but sorry. I'm noticing it grow this entire stream. It's bothering me. Wipe your mouth, man.
For him to issue commands that would be incompatible with his
I
own
have
moral
to tell
character.
deconverted man that's actually a Canaanite skull on the bookshelf there.
What's that?
Oh, I said that's a Canaanite skull on the bookshelf.
You see?
So it's not arbitrary or capricious. And therefore, the whole question devolves to this. In issuing these commands, did God wrong somebody in a way that would be inconsistent with his justice or with his love? And I couldn't think of anybody that he had wronged in that way, except perhaps for the soldiers who had the grim duty to carry out these awful commands. And even in their case, I think there can be moral justification for issuing such a command. So I feel forced to this position by my...
Okay, so a thought that just popped in. So he said he can't think of anybody that's been wronged by this command, while simultaneously saying that not everybody was actually killed. They were given the option to be driven out of the land. So I think, objectively speaking, you could say that somebody who was wronged, granted that everything else is true, that the babies go to heaven, that that there's some type of justification that he hasn't given for the soldiers committing the acts, and for the people who deserved divine judgment that were killed. He's saying that you were given the opportunity to leave. So I wonder what his defense would be for the survivors who did take that opportunity to leave, who also had family members who were slaughtered in the genocide. Were they not wronged?
Well, yeah, where the virgin's taken, but they would just make up excuses like, oh, they got him out of that harmful situation, or
Well, but yeah, maybe they were out of the harmful situation, but their practices wouldn't have changed. It's not like they were driven out of their land and all of a sudden they're not doing these immoral acts
yeah,
anymore.
they
But
didn't
I mean,
become
still,
Boy
you lost a
Scouts.
brother, a sister, a cousin, a loved one, of some type of a friend. Like, how are they not wronged? Man, I wish I could ask William Lane Craig some questions. What's the thing that he can't think of anybody that was wronged, but somebody lost a brother who survived and left the land, according to him, for some reason they were able to leave.
Yeah, and
They were
even if
wronged.
okay, like say in the thing of the virgins, you had a male boy who was killed. Oh, no, you wouldn't have a baby, would you, if you're a virgin? Damn it, that doesn't work. Oh, but anyway, like yeah, you're right, I was gonna say kid, but we'll use brothers and sisters instead, and then you could be
Well,
separate. you could be separated from these people for eternity because, like, say you have a baby brother, that baby goes to heaven, like he says, but then you're a 21-year-old newlywed woman or whatever, and you get killed. But now you don't get to see your baby brother because you go right to hell, he goes to heaven. But then he'll just say, he flips it to the justice. Then, like, you deserved it. You deserve to get killed, like a 21-year-old newlywed woman. Like,
Well, maybe they okay, yeah, that's what I was saying. Like, grant all the arguments. Maybe they deserve to get killed, but were you not wronged for obeying the divine command, right? Leave die. So you obeyed that, you didn't go against the divine command. But like you said with the kid, you could still have, there could be parents whose children were killed in this. Were the parents not wronged in any way? They chose to leave, but maybe the reason they couldn't gather their kids, they can only take 2 out of the 3. Somebody lost some family members here. Were not wronged in this.
well, not only finitely but also infinitely.
Yeah, in both.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you said. Yeah.
Reflection upon.
I was just to say, yeah, pretty soon we're gonna get to the point where actually none of this actually matters that we're talking about. So keep going.
Well, glad.
On the objectivity and basis of moral values and duties.
Well, I've told you how I feel about it, and I know that we're out
I
of
know.
time. It's a shame that we won't get to see you and Dawkins, at least it seems, have this conversation directly. But Dr. Craig, I really do appreciate you coming back on the show, especially to defend what is, on the surface, a difficult and, as far as people like Dawkins would see it, indefensible position. So it means all the more that you would be willing to come on a show like this and defend the
Certainly. Now, can we add one thing here at the end that we didn't get to?
Of course.
One of the commendable and for me surprising things about Professor Dawkins is that he understood what the implication or the importance of this objection is. This is not an objection to the existence of God. This is not an objection to the moral argument for God's existence. What is it an objection to? It's an objection to biblical inerrancy. And therefore, Dawkins will say,
And there it
sophisticated
is.
theologians.
That's the whole reason that he's arguing for this. It has nothing to do with morality. It has nothing to do with whatever else he said. It's defending biblical inerrancy. And now it all makes sense, people.
So maybe I missed something. Is he saying that
He needs the Bible to be true. That's why he has to defend these parts of the Bible. It's not because of the moral stuff. These are all just means to an end. The end being the Bible needs to be true.
the Bible's true, the Bible's correct? Okay.
Because then his whole fairy tale that he's built will crash if it's not.
Yeah, good catch. Yeah, it would have went right over my head.
Will say that this story in the Old Testament is simply false, that it's either legendary or else Israel, carried away by its nationalistic fervor, thought that God had given them a divine command when they really hadn't. So that what this calls into question is not any of the core doctrines of the Judeo-Christian worldview, but simply a view of biblical inerrancy.
I think we pointed out quite a few times where it calls into question the consistency of the Bible and the Judeo-Christian worldview.
I would agree with that. And
Yeah.
within his own reasoning, too.
Yeah.
And I gathered from Dawkins' comments to you that he doesn't seem to think that that's really a very serious objection. I think that he's probably familiar with a lot of British Christians who are not committed to a doctrine of biblical inerrancy, and therefore don't feel that this affects the core tenets of a Judeo-Christian worldview. And I think that's quite right. So that even if I'm completely wrong in what's said, I don't think that it has tremendously significant implications for the truth of the Judeo-Christian worldview.
An important clarification, and I think you're right that Dawkins did see the objection he was raising as something that one can respond to by simply saying, well, I don't think these stories occurred. What that says about the viability of the Bible, of course, is a separate question, but I'm glad I got to mention it at the end there. Dr. Craig, thanks again. It's been...
Thank you, Alex. Good to be with you.
Let's just say I'm interested to see what people are going to say about this one. If you want...